you. Thank you. I'd like to start by acknowledging the work of my fellow colleagues, Sofia Rongvist and Karin Magnusson, who are also co-authors of the book and who also worked on this project, part of which I will be presenting to you here today. So I only have 15 minutes, and I'm going to speak very fast. So why study deportation? I think that's an obvious question. With increasing immigration, migrant returns are also likely to increase. Forced return or deportation is the most controversial and sensitive area of returns. Deportation is controversial primarily because of the negative effects that it has on migrants. We have all heard stories where migrants at risk of deportation attempt suicide, or even when migrants die in the process of being deported. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. We do not hear about most deportations, which can be relatively unproblematic for the state. Deportation is therefore a sensitive area because even those deportations that are unproblematic or do not make it to the news still have an extremely negative effect on migrants' lives and health. Deportation, more recently, is being flagged by the European Commissioner of Migration and also by the Swedish government as one of the solutions to the current refugee crisis. This is ground, as you will see in what I'm going to present, which we should tread very carefully because we have very little research on the effects of deportation on migrants. I will show you today that even when a country's laws and institutions are constructed diligently and carefully, as they are here in Sweden, the effects of deportation on the migrants remains extremely negative. For migrants in Sweden, deportation evokes an all-consuming fear. It is a fear not of the local institutions, it is a fear of being returned back home. This study should not serve, I should say this right away, to demotivate people working in the institutions here in Sweden, but rather it shows how in a sensitive area like deportations, listening to the migrants and constant reflection on human rights principles is necessary in order to minimize as much as possible the negative effects. So this is what I will be doing today. I will be giving you a very short background of returns from Sweden. I will take you through some migrant narratives and will show you some quotes from the migrants. And finally, I will list some of the outcomes of this study, whereby we use these migrant narratives in order to list some human rights considerations for the authorities to keep in mind. And I will start by showing you this chart. It is useful to understand deportation. It is useful to think of returns, migrant returns, on a continuum. The first two are deportations, forced return, and the last two are voluntary. So I'm showing you the spectrum because deportations can be anywhere on the spectrum, from very high security, where a lot of force is used, to much less. And the same goes for assisted voluntary return. And it is important to think about returns in this way because, of course, deportations denote the unwillingness of migrants to return, and here you have migrant willingness to return. But you also have very high costs for the state at the far end and very low costs here. And from our point of view, the higher the security and the more force is used, there is a higher chance of human rights violations, which is something that we would want to avoid. Forced return takes place in Sweden when a migrant refuses to collaborate in the implementation of the return decision. Most forced returnees are asylum seekers, and the police need to be involved because it is envisaged that some element of force will be used. Only some of these people are in detention centers in Forvar. Others are in hiding, but many others are actually living in the community, some also living in accommodation provided by Migrationsverket, and are in regular communication with the police. So we shouldn't only think of deportees as people who are in detention today. On the other hand, at this end of the spectrum, these are people who have collaborated with the authorities in organizing their return back. But this is another subject which I won't go into today. When we look at numbers, last year, Sweden deported, so forced returns from Sweden, there were 2,766. And those are the three little slices up there. All the rest were voluntary return. This denotes the successful policy that the migration agency, that Migrationsverket has embarked on in order to encourage more people to return voluntarily, which, as we saw in the chart before, is a good thing. When we speak of deportations and the laws surrounding deportation, we speak about the European Return Directive, which is the main European law in this field. This law was transposed into the Swedish Aliens Act in 2012, and it very clearly says that detention of third country nationals should be treated in a humane and dignified manner. And second, that forced removal shall be implemented in accordance with fundamental rights and with due respect for the dignity and physical integrity. So here we have a clear mandate that forced returns should take into consideration, should make sure that human rights are mainstreamed at every level of the forced return. Just still by way of introduction, in a way, or by giving you a background, Sweden has developed numerous policies and institutions that go a long way into ensuring that forced returns are conducted in a manner that is consistent with human rights. Although in practice there are many gaps and issues that need to be tackled, overall, these characteristics are achievements that the country should be proud of. And this is the list of these 5 achievements which I'm going to flag here. The first is that detention and deportation are not outsourced to private profit-making companies, as they are in many other countries, with disastrous effects. Detention centers are managed by civil officers, by Migrationsverket employees, and not by security officers, the police or army. This is part of what I call an overall decriminalisation policy, which Sweden should also be proud of. There are wide-ranging welfare benefits of a basic nature which also cover some of the needs of irregular migrants, so migrants who have been given a return decision but are not collaborating. And finally, as I have shown, that there is national priority given to voluntary returns. However, and this is where our research becomes particularly interesting and revealing, in spite of these legal and institutional achievements, for migrants, the experience of deportation remains essentially a devastating one. I will now go through some of the main narratives which Lotta has so kindly introduced before, and I will show you what the migrants think, and then we will move on to the human rights considerations that are the findings or the result of this study. So the first big category, we've called it in limbo. Migrants feel stuck. Migrants demonstrate a very high level of stress and anxiety. It was very clear that their health and their psychosocial well-being were negatively impacted, and they feel stuck. It's like a prison, but an open prison. You are free to move, but you cannot go anywhere. And this quote refers to the restricted participation in society, partly brought about as a result of the loss of welfare and other rights, But also, for those who are in hiding, the fear of being caught restricts their movements very much. Quote 2, before I thought a lot about my future and what I wanted to become and things like that. But now, when I lost hope, I don't think so much. I don't have the energy right now. And this again shows the migrant who's tired, who's weary, who's lost hope. And migrants often mention symptoms which clearly denote mental health problems, such as low energy, fatigue, inability to focus, paranoia, inability to sleep. These are migrants who are seriously suffering through this process. Migrants' fear of being returned back is what keeps them in this situation, because they could go to Migrationsverket and say, I will collaborate. They do not do that because they fear being returned back. So they prefer living in the state than being returned back. And quote 3 shows a migrant who was scared of going outside. This was a migrant who also had a family and kids and didn't allow the kids to go outside for fear of being apprehended by the police. The second trend in the migrants' narratives that often came up is the inability to comprehend a very complex bureaucratic system which they perceived as arbitrary and not transparent. When the migration board said, we will deport you, we said, we can't go. They took all the 3 decisions in about 3 months, and they want to deport us back to Afghanistan from where we fled. And the second one, I am deeply disappointed. The authorities should know how much I am suffering, how I am hurt. Migrants fail to understand how serious decisions about their lives can be taken by what they perceive as very detached bureaucrats. They feel their cases are treated impersonally and often mention how they would like to see more sympathy from the system. In particular, they complain about the communication of the return decision itself. I've put in the last quote because, which says, if you're not collaborating, we'll move your case to the police. Migrants do not realize that when migration agency officers tell them this, their lives are going to deteriorate quite significantly, because at that point they will become forced returnees. Their case is moved from Migrationsverket to the police. So migrants are concerned that this system lacks fairness, and they feel that the system has many areas where decisions are taken in an arbitrary manner. We are in no position to judge this, but we feel that when the receiver, the client, is repeatedly saying this, then maybe there is a lack of transparency in the system, and maybe more communication is needed with the migrants, as we will see in some of the conclusions. And finally, a very strong theme that came out, which was rather surprising, because as I have told you in the beginning, Sweden has embarked on an overall policy of decriminalization. Sweden has not decriminalized irregular migration, so being an irregular migrant in the law, but in practice, Sweden is aiming not to criminalize migrants who are being returned. In spite of this, this is what migrants feel. They acted in such a way as if I had committed a grave crime, such as causing a death or a big crime. I am not a criminal, but I am treated like a criminal. Remember, many of these people are very cautious of not breaking any laws, not breaking any criminal laws, because they would like to settle and integrate into the country. They're seeking asylum in this country. This is a huge source of distress for migrants. They feel they are unjustly treated like criminals. They feel that deportation is a punishment, whereas in the Swedish law it's very clear that deportation is an administrative measure. So they are not put in prison. They are put in They are detained for some time and then returned to their country of origin. And the police often do not press charges even though they can do it according to the law. Still, migrants feel that deportation is punishment. And they feel, they have mentioned the good standards and conditions in the Forvar. Yes, it is a prison. Even if they get good food there every day, he's speaking about himself, and they can eat as much as they want, but it does not help. So the mere fact of being detained obscures all the standards, institutional standards that have been achieved within these Forvar. These empirical conclusions are rich and of course are much more detailed in the book and multi-layered. From this knowledge, direct from migrants, our analysis yielded clear human rights considerations. These considerations will be useful to policymakers and practitioners in order to minimize the negative effects of deportation and the harm that might come out of it. And therefore, possibly, to try and make the deportation process, if at all possible, a little bit more dignified. So these are some of the conclusions that we've passed on to policymakers and practitioners. The rights to quality of life, well-being, and health should be considered, should be given priority, I would add, in situations where migrants are in limbo. We forget that migrants' health deteriorates quite rapidly when a person is in limbo of this kind. Therefore, the state should work to limit these in-limbo periods, and this is especially problematic in protracted situations. We have interviewed a number of stateless people who have been in protracted limbo situations for a very long time. A third point is that the principles of fairness and transparency need to be present at every level of the system. And arbitrary decision-making, if that were the case, can be avoided through careful documentation and through careful reporting and evaluation of these reports. We have also mentioned the importance of better communication with the migrants. And this is a very difficult point to achieve because migrants, when you're in a situation, I think when anyone is in a situation where they've heard very bad news, life-changing news, they find it, anyone would find it very difficult to understand, to try and grapple with how a system works, what the implications are. And so it requires a lot of patience and very good skills from the sides of the officers. A fifth point is something that the migrants mentioned very often, which I didn't have time to go into here, is that the quality of legal aid and the interaction between lawyers and migrants varies widely. Without lawyers, given that we do have a complex bureaucratic system, which sometimes is needed in order to make sure that there are the adequate checks and balances within the system, without a lawyer, migrants are lost. I would add, without a good lawyer, they are lost. The sixth point is tactics of control. When migrants are detained in Forvar, the reason for their detention is that they are considered to be aggressive or at risk of absconding, of running away. And therefore, within Forvar settings, but even in other settings, for example, during the transportation of the migrant to the flight back home, tactics of control that are used are the same that are used in other settings as well. So we have handcuffs, we have several means of chains and that are used, and we have different tactics that the officers are allowed to use. This is a source of great distress for migrants. This is one of the issues that makes migrants feel very, very criminalized, and therefore we are suggesting that you can't do away with these tactics of control, but they need to be monitored and reevaluated. Do we always need to use them? The seventh point is that pre-removal detention, just as it is in the Swedish Aliens Act, should remain as the very last resort. I said that migrants' health deteriorates significantly when they're in this limbo system, when they're in this limbo period. Migrants' health nosedives again when they are in detention. And we have seen this in our interviews, but there are various other reports which show that being detained significantly negatively impacts a person's health. And finally, the final point that I'm putting forward here is whether irregular stay in Sweden, so persons without a residence permit, should that be decriminalized in law once in practice Sweden has in fact decriminalizing policies. So maybe that could be a final note for the authorities to take note of. And finally, this presentation has shown, to come back again to my very first introduction, that even though this is a very difficult task, the authorities have a responsibility to build deportation systems which do the least harm. Second, that the migrant needs to listen, the system needs to listen to migrants. And this is not the role of researchers, but this should be something inbuilt within the system. How are migrants experiencing the system, and how can we build a system that is more, that does less harm? And finally, the last point that I want to leave you with is that human rights wisdom, and by this I mean human rights laws and human rights reports, because there are many, can help in minimizing the harm that could be done. And so we should make good use of that. That is all from me. I will be happy to take any questions. This was a very brief presentation of a very long project and a long book. So I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.